Our scripture reading this morning is found in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. It says, "And they came to Bethesda, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see men, for I see them like trees walking around.' Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored. And he began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, 'Do not even enter the village.'"
First of all, I want to welcome everyone and say happy Thanksgiving. I hope everyone has a happy holiday coming up. And as we talk about this time of year, I was trying to think about what I might bring out. And I thought, there are so many different things that we could talk about. But, we have so many different ways that the Lord can reach each one of us. And one of the ways that I thought of was through our different senses. Everybody knows the five senses that we have. We have what? Touch, taste, smell, hearing, and seeing. And so I thought, well, which one of these, if I was going to talk about one of these, which one of these would I be most likely to be willing to give up? And I thought, of all of them, I think the one that if I would be the least likely to give up would be my eyesight. Because I love to see things. I love to see the things that are going on. I'm actually a very visual individual to try to see things the way they are. And, if you start studying the eye at all, you start talking about rods and cones for the colors and how the muscles in the eye actually flatten and open and close the cornea to reflect back onto the optic nerve. I thought, wow, this is just so incredible. And then I started thinking about these individuals in the Bible who have actually had their sights removed and then restored. And I don't know, we just went through this a little bit with Linda. She had her cataracts removed. And I was really kind of surprised because the first thing she would say is, "Wow, everything is so bright and it's so colorful." And I hadn't really thought about, I knew she was struggling to read and stuff like that. But the colors that were developing were she said it was just incredible, the different changes. And I don't know about how many of you, maybe some of you, have any of you lost your eyesight for any time at all? Well, Linda and I hadn't been married very long, and being young kids, I had an old car, and I came out from some friend's house, and the car wouldn't start. And I thought, oh, what is it? And it's got to be the battery. That's the only thing it can be. And I don't know about many of you now who actually look at your batteries, they're pretty well sealed on top. But that's not the way it was 45 years ago, 50 years ago. What did we do? We actually you could actually pop the tops off. And you could look down into the different cells of the battery and see which ones still had fluid in them. You could put water in them and stuff like that. Well, when I had come out, it was dark. And I didn't think anything about it. I thought, oh, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to check my battery? And a friend of mine says, "Oh, here's some matches." And I thought, oh, sure, that's fine. And so I popped the lid off of the first set, and I struck a match, and I looked. No, it's fine, that one's fine, that one's fine. And I put those down, and I popped the next one off, and as I put the match down over the top of the opening, what happened? It's right, went boom. And all the acid that was in there come right back up and caught me right straight in the face. Well, so what did I do? Well, I went in and washed it off a little bit. And then we went on home, and through insistence of my wife, which was probably very, very true, we did go to the hospital. And they actually put some gel and stuff into my eyes, and they put patches on both eyes for multiple days. And so I was home in kind of a different world, you know. She would set a plate down in front of me and say, okay, corn's at 3 o'clock. You know, your veg links are at 2 o'clock. You know, and I had to figure out where everything was on my plate, and it was really different. And so as I looked at these different individuals in the Bible, if we take your Bibles and open with me to Mark 8, this first individual that we look at, he was a blind man in Bethesda, and as Mark 8 starting verse 22, it says, then Jesus came to Bethesda, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. Now, what do we see here in this scenario? So Jesus actually takes the blind man, and he actually takes him out of town, which was a little different than most of the scenarios. And when he actually makes a little spittle and he puts it on his eyes, the man doesn't see right away. He says, well, I see people, but they kind of look like trees, and all he had to go on was a description of what a tree might look like. And he said, they look like trees moving around. And then Jesus touched his eyes again, and he saw everything clearly. But do you notice what happened, though, there in verse 22? It says, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. It doesn't say that the blind man had any initiative at all. He may not have had any faith at all in what Christ was going to do. But these people brought him and said, please touch his eyes. And so I believe that when he started doing this, that Christ actually, when he started seeing a little bit, this increased his faith. And as his faith was increased, then Christ was able to continue and finish healing him. And I think that's why he was healed in stages, which was quite a bit different than many of the others that were healed like that. But can you imagine verse 26, though? Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into town nor tell anyone in town. Now, you haven't had your eyesight we're not told how long this man was without his eyesight, but can you imagine being blind and then all of a sudden you can see everything and being told not to tell anybody? I think it would be just a natural occurrence for me anyway, that I'd probably be running down the lanes and screaming and shouting and jumping, just telling everybody about what has happened. So let's turn to another story. We're going to look at it. It's in Mark 10. Just turn over another couple pages in your Bibles. And we're going to look at Mark 10 and verse 46. And now we see Jesus coming into the town of Jericho. And this is a little bit different. It says, he went into Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, and blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the road begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out, saying, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Then many warned him to be quiet, and he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. So Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. Then they called the blind man and saying to him, Be of good cheer, rise, he is calling you. And throwing aside his garment, he rose and came to Jesus. Let's just pause there for just a second. What do you see here in this individual? Excitement? Hope? He had faith. He had faith already there. And he had evidently heard about this Jesus who was able to heal and to cleanse and to raise people from the dead. So he had this faith, as Mark said, the faith that there was something that could be done for him. And as we go on, and so Jesus answered and said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "Rabboni," or Rabbi, that I may receive my sight. Jesus didn't even touch him. He says, "Then go your way. Your faith has made you well." And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. And if you look at it, you can get a little bit of a picture here. They said to him, "Be of good cheer," in verse 49. "Rise, he is calling you." And so what does he do? Immediately, he throws away his garment and his covering, and he jumps up, and he came to Jesus. It doesn't say that somebody brought him to Jesus. He came on his own power, and he could tell by where Jesus' voice was. And so he had this faith, this living faith, that actually was able to allow him to be healed in a much different manner. Let's turn over now in our Bibles to John 9. And this is another story about an individual. But this individual was quite a bit different. If we look at John 9, and we're going to start with verse 1. It says, "Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was born blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" Now, we have to understand the Israelite thinking of that time, that everything that happened, you were either blessed by God or you were cursed by God, depending on what you did or your status in life. And so they were saying, the disciples were saying, what caused this? Whose sins caused all this problem? And Jesus says, nobody's sinned. In verse 3 it says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And when he had said these things, Jesus actually spat on the ground again and put clay on the gentleman's eyes and said, "Go wash." So here we actually see a little different scenario. We see Jesus actually going forward and finding the man and putting clay on his eyes and then telling him to go wash in the pool. And then the scenario widens a little bit, because the neighbors and those who were previously had been seen with him said, well, isn't this the blind guy? And some said, no, this is just somebody that looks like him. And he said, no, I am the blind person. And of course, as we read on through the story, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they weren't very happy because Christ had healed this man on the Sabbath. And so they said, oh, he's just got to be a sinner. And the man turns to him and says, well, I don't know whether he's a sinner or whether he's not. All I know is I was born blind, and now I can see. And so it was so interesting and the Pharisees, there began to become a division, because some of the Pharisees said, well, he's got to be a sinner. He can't, because he did this on Sabbath. And others of them said, how can anybody that's a sinner do these kind of miracles? And so there was actually starting to be a little division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so they actually brought in the parents, as we read on in the story. And the parents were very afraid of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, because they didn't want to be kicked out of the synagogue. And so they were actually found the rumors that if you were actually talking about this Jesus, you could actually be kicked out of the synagogue. So as they passed on they brought in the parents, and the parents said, well, we know he was blind, and we know this is our son, but, he's of age. You ask him when it took place. He's old enough. And so it's interesting, the man goes through the scenario, exactly what took place. And then the Pharisees ask him a second time, well, how are you healed? And then he said, this man did this and this and this. And they said, well, he can't be, he's got to be a sinner or something like that. And then they said, well, tell us again how it happened. And by this time, the individual, the man is getting kind of frustrated. And he said, I've already told you twice. He said, do you want to become his disciples? And they were just infuriated at that. So we see that how he was healed and brought forth, and how even though he came into the church, the church people couldn't believe that this would take place the way that it did. There's another individual that I wanted to mention too. This young lady, she was actually a young lady. She was born in Putnam County in New York State. And as a young girl, less than 2 months old, she became sick with an infection in her eyes. And her doctor actually was out of town that time period. And so this individual came up saying that he was a doctor, and he prescribed these hot mustard poultices to put on her eyes to heal this infection. Well, the disease process actually went away, but the hot poultices actually burned both of her eyes, and she was blind from 6 weeks old on. It was really hard on their family because, and I think many of us have heard of this individual. Her name is Frances Jane Crosby, but she goes by Fanny most of the time. And she was born in March 24th of 1820 in upper New York State. And her father actually became ill November after she was born in March. He became ill in November, and he passed away. And so here, Fanny's mother was 21 years old with a blind daughter, raising her and trying to support her by herself. So she actually took Fanny over to her mother, and her mother was bound and determined that Fanny would not be afraid of the things of being blind. And so she would do all different kinds of things. She would bring in different materials that had different textures. She'd bring in different sounds and take her out into nature. She would just sit there and just describe things that were going on. And these all just really brightened Fanny. And she kept such a sense of humor in everything that she did. It says she was full of fun and joined in the other kids. And the other kids would play games. They would describe the games to Fanny. And Fanny's imagination would just run wild with these. And she would learn how to, says she could run over, climb rocks, and she would ride horses. All of this in her imagination. But as her mother continued on, her mother felt so bad that Fanny was blind that she set up an appointment for a doctor in New York. And she took her daughter to this doctor and said, what can we do? How can we help Fanny? He said, he took and he went through his regular processes, and then he turned and he says, my child, he said in memorable tones, you can never be made to see. This really actually crushed the mother, but it didn't bother Fanny at all. She was so joyful and happy in her life, even though she was blind. And her first love then began her poetry, and the first verse that she ever wrote was at age 8, and it echoed her entire life, all summed up in 8 little lines. She said, oh, what a happy soul I am. Although I cannot see, I am resolved that in this world contented I will be. How many blessings I enjoy that other people don't. To weep and sigh because I'm blind, I cannot and I won't. At age 14, though, they were actually found out that there was a blind school being established right there in New York City. And Fanny's mother really worked hard through her housekeeping and stuff like that. And she actually was developing relationships. And they found out that there was an opening at the school, and Fanny applied and was able to get into this blind school in New York. And of course, as she would continue to write poetry, she would describe things that were going on. And the other kids just loved her poetry, and they loved her outgoing nature. And this New York Institute for the Blind was to be Fanny's home for 23 years, 12 of them as a student, and then 11 more as a teacher. And she initially indulged in her own poetry, but was called to pen verses for different occasions when different individuals would come around. But Fanny loved the Bible. And while she enjoyed her poetry, she zealously went after the Bible, and she started memorizing in her young years as much as 5 chapters a week. And even as a child, she could go through the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And she also had Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Song of Solomon, and many of the Psalms, all memorized by heart. And it was just incredible to gain the education that she was beginning and developing. And when her father had passed away, her mother didn't have a lot going on. But Fanny's spirits were were so high, and so she was so good at writing songs and Bibles songs for different things and stories. But she was afraid, one of her teachers was afraid that all this was going to go to her head. And so he actually took her aside and he said, Fanny, he said, shun the flatterers as you would a viper. And Fanny always remembered that, how flattery can cause problems in your life. It's really interesting, too, because this school for the blind was a main place where many dignitaries would come. William Cullen Bryant would come in and read his poems. Horace Greeley was a frequent visitor. President Polk came and made his impressions. General Winfield Scott would always cause excitement when he came. And Miss Crosby particularly liked Henry Clay because of his loud and deep voice. And for a time there at the school, there was even a young man who was actually an assistant, and his name was Grover Cleveland. And as they followed him on through, they were not surprised at his ability to become president of the United States. On one occasion, there was a pastor that came up and he said, Fanny, I think it's a great pity that the Lord didn't give you sight when he showered you with so many gifts. And Fanny turned to him and she said, if I had one request at birth, she said, and if I could make this one petition to the Lord, she said, it would be that I would be born blind. Because when I get to heaven, she said, the first face that I'll ever gladden my sight will be that of the Lord's. Fanny Crosby wrote over 8,000 songs and hymns, many of which the most popular in all the Christian denomination. But if I mention names like Carrie Bell or James Black, Henrietta Blair, do you have any idea who these individuals are? Charles Bruce, Ella Dale, Mrs. Edna Forrest. Have you ever heard of any of these names? These were all pen names for Fanny. The publishers were so afraid that the whole hymn book would be entirely Fanny's name in it, that they requested that she started making using pen names. And I've got a list here of over 98 different pen names that she used throughout her lifetime as she wrote stories and wrote her poems. And many of these poems were put to music, not by Fanny herself, but by her husband-to-be. Her husband was Alexander Alstein, and he was actually one of the students at the school. And he was actually about 10 years younger than she was, but he practiced just like she did, and his specialty was the organ, and he was one of the best organists in all of New York State. And so it was really interesting that they would get together, and many of the things that Fanny would write, Mr. Alstein would actually put to music. And she had many others, as we've seen in our hymn books, who actually came to her for lyrics to their music that they had done. But it didn't take very long. Fanny was only 23 years old the first time she addressed Congress and the presidents. In fact, she knew all of the chief executives of her lifetime, especially Grover Cleveland, who served as the secretary at the Blind Institute before his election. Fanny Crosby was the first woman to ever speak in the United States Senate. And she did this by writing in this poem. It says, "O ye who here from every state convene, illustrious band, may we not hope the scene you now behold will prove to every mind, instruction hath a ray to cheer the blind." And she was a very big proponent of trying to find ways to expand these schools for the blind throughout. And she was very successful in getting these things going on. Fanny would also say, it's not enough to have a song on your lips. You must have a song in your heart. And as we've sung through some of our songs, take the world, but give me Jesus. In his cross my trust shall be, till with a clearer, brighter vision, face to face, my Lord I see. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed through his infinite mercy, his child, and forever I am. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine, heir of salvation and purchase of God, born of his Spirit and washed in his blood. Fanny said, "It seemed intended by the blessed providence of God that I should be blind all my life. I thank him for that. If perfect earthly sight were offered me tomorrow, I would not accept it. I might not have sung hymns to the praise of God if I had been distracted by the beautiful and interesting things that were around me." And as I mentioned, she later married Alexander Van Alstein, who was actually 10 years younger and one of her students at the blind school. But he went on to study organ, and Fanny, not to be outdone, she became very accomplished on the harp and the piano and the guitar and many other instruments that she had come to love. But in 1959, the Alsteins had a daughter who they named Frances after her. But soon, within just a few weeks after her birth, she died. But many people believe it was SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. But Fanny wrote a song shortly after that, "Safe in the Arms of Jesus." For the first year of marriage, Fanny thrived in the role of a housewife, but before long she felt the restlessness of God's work. She battled depression with the death of her first and only child in infancy, but it was something that Fanny would never talk much about. Like herself, her husband was a musician, And he wrote many of the songs. I did put many of the songs to music to most of her words that she had written. You know, it said presidents and ambassadors, war generals, and the nationwide churches knew her poetry and music, and they just devoured it. But Fanny's accomplishments didn't lead to her pride. Her poems were the public what they expected, but didn't contain half of what her soul was proclaiming about God and heaven. She wanted her poetry to lift people's souls toward Jesus and salvation, not to coddle them with a false warmth. That and the traveling and teaching were taking a toll on her health. Fanny's uncanny ability to set words to music and likewise to improvise music to words made her noticeable to the world of the church's music. She also wrote for those who didn't want to hear preaching from the pulpit. And she also wrote for the poor. She wanted these individuals to meet the Jesus that she knew. And Fanny identified so much with the poor in New York City that she actually moved into the slums for the last 35 years of her life, trying to make their lives better and trying to get overcrowding and rundown conditions reversed in New York City. But she actually moved into these areas to work with the people. You know, many of these songs, such as Safe in the Arms of Jesus, I Am Thine, O Lord, and To God Be the Glory, were favorites that were sung all over the world. Fanny had a way of attaching the message of Jesus into daily life, which gave worshipers something to relate to. She would go on to write songs for Dwight L. Moody and for his soloist, Ira Shankey, back in the 1880s. She dedicated her ministry and preaching to several local missions. She saw both of these as ways to offer hope and lead people to this decision to follow Christ. In fact, many of her hymns were inspired by her missions work in New York City. Blindness didn't stop Fanny from writing or helping in Christian rescue missions. From 1880 to 1915, Fanny moved about the slums of New York, living among the poor that she had worked so hard to improve. She worked at these missions and wrote until her death in 1915, 1 month before her 95th birthday. You know, as we think about the blessings that the Lord has given each one of us, especially at this Thanksgiving season, I think we should pause and give him thanks for all the things that he's done for us, the way that he's blessed us. And I think it would, help us to realize that we can use their talents and the things that we have to help others and to draw them and to uplift Christ around us and be thankful for all that he's done in our lives. Let's close now with another song from Fanny, hymn number 337, Redeemed. Let's all stand. Hymn number 337. Redeemed, now I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed through his infinite mercy, his child and forever